They're 12 miles away in rural South Dakota. Now, the average rancher is probably 5 or 6 miles from his nearest neighbor, and the two ranches that are both operated by their brothers are 10 or so miles away from the nearest town. And the towns have about 100 people each, and they're 12 miles apart on the railroad spur. And I've always heard the great debates. Clifford, you came from Vivian, South Dakota, population of 100 or so. And Louise, you came from Draper, South Dakota, population about 100 or so, about 12 miles apart. Which town was superior?
Oh, did you have to bring that up? I think we were far superior in those days, but now I have to say Vivian is an up-and-coming little village.
I wouldn't even concede in those days.
Oh, well, he just stubborn then.
When they put the railroad through, this was after my mother had come out, her folks had came out, they put a railroad through from, it came to Chamberlain. She took a pontoon bridge across the Missouri River at Chamberlain, and then they went out by wagon from there, the next 60 miles by wagon. And they put the railroad to the next few years. At about 1905, 1906, the railroad went through, and they built a town, and they put a station every 12 miles on the railroad.
For water, they had to have water for the locomotives.
And those became the stations and the rail elevators, and in those towns, most of them are dying out now because they can't support that many towns.
So most of these little towns are one great wide dirt road with a high crown in the center, and then the buildings are square front, false front square buildings, and they look like a classic western town, and there's virtually no business in them now. Maybe one or two little stores would be open.
Anyway, for 34, then I started high school, and because money was tight, my dad bid in the school route, bus route. There was just our family and another on the route, and I drove the school bus. I was a freshman in high school. I had a Model A Ford. There was only 5 kids, I think, and 3 or 4 of us and a couple others. And drove the school bus in my freshman and sophomore years. I didn't have any driver's license those days, so no problem with that. And then again in my senior year, I drove the school bus in high school.
See, we didn't do that. My brother and I, my parents just thought we were too young to go to high school, too young and wild. And so the first year we didn't go to high school. We stayed home, but we had the same teacher, and my mother was on the school board, the same teacher that had taught her when she was going to grade school, Mrs. Edith Martin. So we went back to school every day until it was time to start the crops when my brother helped. But she let me do things like take the attendance records and help the little kids learn to read. So I learned how to be a teacher just from the things I did in the 8th grade. Plus, we did our history and our geography and our civics and so forth. And then the next year when we finally started high school, they still thought we were pretty wild and everything, but our teacher, Mrs. Martin, went to the Teachers Institute, and that was 5 weeks after school had started. And she said, I will give Louise and Laverne, my twin brother, a ride to school so they didn't get started, because my mother was very anxious for us to get started, even though they couldn't afford it and everything. So those first 3 days were Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and we got all the assignments. And then on Monday we had, maybe it was Friday, we had a test anyway. And the teacher announced that Laverne and I did the best of anybody on school, even though we'd only been to school 3 days. Apparently the rest of them goofed off in school. We went home and studied that history book like mad. This was history, because we wanted to know what we'd missed, you know. So we had a pretty easy time in high school because I think of that extra year, even though it looked terrible at the time, we couldn't go to high school. I wanted to say something else too about how hard times were. Every item of clothing, I believe, except shoes, was made by my mother, and most of them were made over from coats. She took coats and made them over into little coats for us. And when she bought cloth to make, by this time we had 5 kids all together, she would order from the Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward catalog, and she'd get remnants. There'd be 10 yards of goods. There'd be two pieces that were 4 yards each, and one that was 3. Does that make 10? No, 2 that were 3 and 1 that was 4, right? So one 3-yard piece was to make a dress for Ida, 1 was for me, and the 4 yards were for her. She took the scraps and she made dresses for my little sister. And she was a real good seamstress, and the clothes were very cute. But we just did. I remember yet my very first bought dress. That was his grandmother gave us each a turkey. And so when Dad was hauling things to market, he took the turkeys to Sioux Falls too, and they sold the turkeys. And with that money, for my turkey, I got a dress. and I remember it to this day. We called it a silk dress, but I suppose it was rayon, because that was the material. And my sister got a dress. Mine was blue and hers was green. And that was the first blonde clothes we had. And by that time, I was in the 8th grade.
The high schools, of course, were small, even in town. And like in Vivian, the biggest class, there's only 35 kids in all 4 grades. It was the biggest, I think, 35, 36. My class was 13, and it was the second biggest class in the history of the school. And so one nice thing about it, anything went out for you, it wasn't hard to make the basketball team all 4 years, or I was in the senior class play all 4 years. Things like that, so you could get into all the extracurricular activities you could get into. But there were some drawbacks. We still had electricity in the farms. They had it in town, but not in the farms.
When did you get electricity to the farms?
After the war.
After World War II for both of you?
Yeah, in the 1950s, yeah.
And those of us that don't know much about the rural areas, how about indoor plumbing? Was there indoor plumbing when you were
No, none of that. All outdoor plumbing, and of course, without electricity, you had the old heating stoves. Didn't have any radio, of course. Television hadn't even been invented yet. But we didn't. If you had a radio, you had to have a battery, which got discharged right away with no generator.
We always had radios. I can never remember being without a radio.
But your dad was taking the batteries.
Much younger.
He was taking the batteries into town to get charged up again.
I know, but our radio set up in the corner, and Dad operated it. And we listened to the WLS bar dance on Saturday. And when we got in high school, we wanted to listen to the hit parade or something, but we didn't because Dad had the control. I remember when I met Cliff, though, and they did have a radio then.
That's after the war then.
And she wouldn't let the girls listen to that trash that you could hear on radio. Something like what we think about a lot of the TV programs now.
They started getting wind chargers in during the war, or just before the war. A few of them got it. Those are 12 volt.
This is a windmill that generates electricity.
Yeah. And right after the first year we were married, I helped their dads would put a wind charger in there. And 32,
Grandpa Anderson.
I think it was 32 volts they had at that time.
Grandpa Anderson had a wind charger so that it was like electricity before we did, and I guess we got it before you did in Vivian.
You should talk a little bit about blizzards and prairie fires. That was a big item of...
Well, with all that land, and when it get dry and burned out, the prairie fires, of course, would run pretty far, and most of the time people get out and get them out right away. They've had some bad ones over the years, but